Today's episode is for the fourth day of the month of Teves. We are in the middle of chapter 34, discussing the laws of giving tzedakah, charity. We're going to be completing chapter 34, going from paragraph 14 through paragraph 16. And we're going to start chapter 35, discussing the mitzvah of Challah. As we're going to see, this is not referring to the mitzvah of eating Challah on Shabbos. It's not even referring to the mitzvah of baking Challah. It's referring to the mitzvah of taking off a little piece from any dough that we make. In chapter 35, we'll be doing from paragraph 1 through paragraph 7. So chapter 34, paragraph 14. We discussed some of the priorities that we have in regards to who do we give our tzedakah money to first. There's another level of importance, which says the Mishnah, says the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch, if everything else is equal, then there's a mitzvah to make sure that there's a particular mitzvah to make sure that we're taking care of Torah scholars that are needy, that they have what to put on the table. And just like by a regular destitute person, there's level 1 is just giving them charity, giving them money. Level 2, the highest level, is helping them find a job, or possibly if they're able to, if they have a good business acumen, to lend them money so they can start their own business, so they can support themselves. Paragraph 15. Until now, we've been talking about giving charity. There's also a value in Judaism, which we talked about a little bit, which is not to have to accept charity. If one could get by on less money and not have to accept charity, obviously that's what they should be doing. And we have to make sure that we're managing our money in a financially responsible way in order that we don't have to come on to handouts. Paragraph 16. Anyone that does not need charity, but they put their hand out to take charity, as a consequence for that, they're going to be in a position where they actually will need charity. Anyone who does need charity, they legitimately need people's help, but they're too proud to accept it. And because of that, they're putting their lives in danger, or the lives of their family members in danger. If, God forbid, something happens and someone passes away due to malnutrition because they were too proud to take charity, on some level, that's considered suicide. Such a perspective that's better to put ourselves in a dangerous situation instead of accepting money is an inappropriate perspective. Chapter 35, paragraph 1. If someone makes a dough from one of the following 5 types of grains, from wheat, barley, spelt, oat, or rye, then there's a mitzvah in the Torah to take a small piece of the dough off, and we will give it to the Kohens, to the priests. Now that piece of dough has extra holiness, and therefore the Kohen has to be ritually pure in order to eat it. Nowadays, since we can't be ritually pure because part of the purification process is the paradum, the heifer, we don't have that nowadays, and we don't have the ability to become fully ritually pure nowadays. Therefore, Kohens can't eat it, and therefore, instead of giving it to the Kohen, we burn that little piece instead. Before we take that piece off, there's a blessing that we make. You can find this blessing in the Article Siddur on page 226, around halfway down. There's a blessing that we make saying, "Thank you, God, for this mitzvah of separating challah." At that point, we take off a little piece of the dough, approximately the size of 1 fluid ounce, and then we burn that in the fire. The braided bread that we eat on Shabbos is generally called challah, but really the halachic term challah refers to that little piece of dough that we take off. I'm not sure when or how we started calling the entire loaf of bread that we bake for Shabbos challah, but like I said, halachically speaking, strictly halachically, that piece that we take off, that's really what's called halachically challah. Paragraph 2. How large does that dough have to be that you're making in order to require this mitzvah, this taking off of the challah? So if any dough that you're using, at least if you're dealing with wheat flour at least, if you're using 8 2/3 cups of flour, approximately 2.6 pounds, at that point you have to take off challah. But you only make a blessing if you're using at least 12 1/4 cups of flour, a bit more than 3 2/3 pounds. Paragraph 3. Really, you're supposed to take off this challah piece when it's in a dough form. Let's say you baked some bread and comes out of the oven and you say, "Oh my goodness, I forgot to take off that challah from the bread." What do you do at this point? So what you're supposed to do is you are able to take off challah from a loaf of baked bread as well, but you have to put all the loaves together within one container. Practically, this would mean like you're piling them up on some sort of wide pan. You then put a towel over all the challahs so it turns them into one unit. And then you take off a piece of challah, you make the blessing, and you take off a piece of challah from the baked bread. Paragraph 4. If someone is making sourdough, it's become pretty popular nowadays for people to make sourdough at home. So if you're taking sourdough bread, the way it works is that, for anyone that isn't used to it, you take a little piece of, you ferment a little piece of dough, you let it sit around until it starts Yeast starts fermenting on its own. And then you'll take that dough and you'll add that dough into your loaf of bread. That will cause into your dough. That will cause your dough to rise. And you take a little piece of that and you put it in a container, hold on the side for your next loaf of bread, for the next dough that you bake. So you should take that dough off of your bread before you make the blessing of challah, before you take off the challah from the dough. This is because if you take off challah from this dough and now you separate another piece to use as your starter for your next loaf of bread, this starter already you had challah taken off of it. And if you mix this in and you're not going to take off challah from the second loaf of bread, you might be taking off primarily from the starter, and you can't use that starter. You can't make another blessing on that starter. That starter doesn't need challah taken from it anymore. So it creates halacha complications. So in short, if you're using if you're making sourdough, using a little piece of starter dough for your sourdough. So before you make the blessing on challah, take off a piece to use as a starter for your next loaf of bread if you want to save some for your next sourdough. So I don't know anybody that does it nowadays, but sometimes people will take off a little piece of dough and they ferment that little piece of dough to put into some sort of beet juice, borscht. So in that case, because you're not using it to bake anymore, using it for a drink, then you should only remove that little piece that you'll be using as a starter for your borscht. You should take that off after you remove the challah from your bread, from your loaf. Paragraph 5. You only have to take challah off of dough that was turned into dough when it was owned by a Jew. So if you buy pre-made dough balls in the store, you don't have to worry about taking off challah. Now let's say you buy pre-made starter dough to make sour bread with. So in that case, you're going to take the starter dough that was owned by a non-Jew, it became starter dough by a non-Jew, and now you're going to mix it into your own dough. You're going to have a bit of a problem because that starter dough does not need challah taken off of it, and the dough that you're making, the rest of the dough does need challah taken off of it. So you have to make sure that when you take off a piece of challah, even though we said before, all you have to take off is around 1 fluid ounce, a volume of 1 fluid ounce to take off that little piece of challah. However, because you have starter dough in there, you have to make sure that the amount of challah you're taking off is around 1 ounce more than the volume, 1 fluid ounce more than the volume of that initial starter dough that you used, to ensure that you're taking off at least 1 fluid ounce worth from your own dough. Paragraph 6. If you're making dough to fry or to cook, in that case, you're supposed to take off challah, the little piece again, but you don't make a blessing on it. Let's say you're making dough, and part of the dough you're going to fry, and part of the dough you're going to bake. In that case, because you're baking part of this dough, as long as you're using the volume of flour that we discussed back in paragraph 2, that would require you to take off challah and to make a blessing on that little piece that you take off. Then over here also, even though you're baking a smaller amount, still you do make a blessing when you take off that little piece of challah. Paragraph 7. Regardless of the liquid used to knead the dough with, whether it's water, fruit juice, milk, whatever it is, you have to take challah off. But you only make a blessing if the liquid in the bread in the dough is either water, milk, bees honey, wine, or olive oil. Therefore, if you're making a dough out of just pure fruit juice, then you should make sure to add a little bit of water or one of these other liquids as well, in order that now you could take off the challah with a blessing, with a bracha. This concludes today's episode. Have a wonderful day and see you on the next episode.